Hello, everyone. Welcome to the fifth season podcast, Conversations on Successful Aging. I'm David Lowry, and I'm joined by my friend and co-host Don Drew. We believe aging is a privilege, and we want to have great conversations on how to do it well. Don, how are you today?
Doing great, David. And the conversation I'd like to have today has to do with a confession.
Father David is ready to take your confession.
We spent several months now talking to our listeners about how to age well. And some of the topics we've covered is how to stop over-explaining yourself, right? How to invest in the right relationships, how to choose consistency over intensity, and how to break the rules that don't serve you anymore. And somewhere in the middle of producing all that content, I had a moment of clarity where I thought, am I actually doing this? My answer was sometimes, right? Inconsistently, with a lot of room for improvement.
Well, okay, if we're just going to tell everybody the truth, I have the same problem. But a show like this is really good because I've learned so much about aging and aging well from all the programs we've done and the interviews we've done with other people and the research and so forth, Don. So I'm doing better than I was. And I've had this exact same moment. I was rereading one of the scripts, one about stop explaining yourself. And you know what? I still do that, but I'm working on it.
Today, I think what we should do is something a little bit different than what we normally do. Let's
Okay.
turn the tables around on ourselves. And instead of talking about what the research says or what the psychology shows or what most successful aging people do, let's talk about what you and I are actually doing. Let's both do a little confession here, or what we're not doing, and where the gap is between what we know and how we're living.
I'm going to tell you that humbleness is important here because we have room for improvement too, right? But hopefully it'll be interesting and maybe even a little bit funny.
Hopefully, it'll also be genuinely useful because I think there is something valuable in hearing not just the lesson, but the messy, imperfect, very human process of trying to apply it.
Okay, I'm not exactly sure where all of this is going to go, but I trust my co-host Don. Let's get into it.
Let's start with the one that I think is the most personally uncomfortable for me to examine, and that is the whole conversation we had about stopping the over-explaining. Peace comes from fewer justifications.
So we're going to remind our listeners of the core idea one more time, just in case you haven't heard it. So Don, why don't you just tell us what was that all about?
The idea is that so many of us, especially as we've come up through the first half of our lives, we've developed this deep, almost compulsive habit of justifying or explaining our choices or information about ourselves to other people. And we explored what happens when we do that. It's wired in from childhood. It gets reinforced by the workplace, by our families, by social structures. And the brain at some pre-rational level treats social disapproval like genuine threat. That's kind of the crux of the background of what we talked about.
So I remember that program, and we also talked about how we spend enormous amounts of energy just preemptively managing these imaginary conversations we're going to have with other people and their reactions to our decisions.
And the argument we made in that episode is one of the most liberating things you can do in the second half of life. And that is to start releasing that habit, to recognize that you don't owe anyone an explanation and that I don't want to is a complete sentence.
So, how are we doing on all of this?
Well, I'm a work in progress, David. A genuine, ongoing, not yet finished work in progress.
Well, can you give us an example?
This just happened yesterday. I was in a group Zoom online when it came my turn to introduce myself. There was probably, 16, 20 people online, and very few of us knew each other. And I introduced myself as a writer, artist, and podcaster without any further explanation. I didn't say I was a professor emeritus or retired military officer, both of which are true, but that's not my identity now, really. And I didn't bother to explain any details about how I identify what's important to me.
That is fantastic because, Don, I've known you a long time and you've worked very hard for all of those things that you've done in the past. And sometimes people require bona fides of us, right? And so we feel like we have to sort of give them a reason to trust our competence. But sometimes we let that get in the way of being our genuine self. Don, I'm working on this idea of not overly explaining myself, but I feel like I have to give rationales to people when I say no. It's like that's not enough of a reason that people really need to know somewhere about my deep, dark childhood or something like that, or I have to explain myself. And it's taking a little bit more courage to say, I don't think I want to do that, just to really be honest. But I'll tell you where I started learning to be a little more assertive. And believe it or not, it's on the car lot. If you ever have a conversation with some of those guys, they really want to bring you into a conversation and get you to agree to do things or see if we could meet something today. Would you be ready to deal? And one of the things I learned to do was just to say, nope, I'm not going to be interested in that today. I'm not going to do that. And as they say it, sometimes I have to repeat myself multiple times. But some people don't like that they have to do that in those situations. But I found it actually is strong training to get you to do what you need to do. To stand up and say, nope, I'm not going to be interested in that. Today is a day that I'm looking. I'm making decisions. Later on, today is not that day where I'm going to be trying to buy a car or get my best deal. Just state what it is you want to do. It's just been automatic in my life to try to people please and try to get along with everybody and to make sure I don't hurt anybody's feelings. But we all know that sometimes just cut to the chase and just say, no, don't think I want to do it.
Yeah, that's the thing. This habit of explaining or justifying ourselves is so ingrained that by the time we notice it, we're already 3 paragraphs into a justification. As I listened to the other people I was talking about here, introducing themselves, I noticed how much detail they tended to give to justify many of the statements they made about themselves. And I simply thought in that moment, I'm not going to do that. I don't have to think about my justification or about my explanation. What you said there on the car lot, that's progress. It may be uncomfortable at times. We may have to catch ourselves like I did, but it is progress.
So I've still got a little bit of work to do on that, right? The one thing that stuck with me about that episode was this idea of the spotlight effect, where we dramatically overestimate how much people are focusing on us and wanting to hear our point of view. Okay, folks, here's the simple thing that a person our age ought to know. They don't care. They don't really want to know how old you are, how long you've been doing something. They're really focusing on themselves. So just give each other a break here by describing less, justifying ourselves less, and just get to what it is we want to say.
Yeah, the phrase we used in that podcast was defending ourselves against a court that's not in session.
Yeah, catching yourself shadowboxing, and there's nobody in the ring. It's just an imaginary fight. Okay, you've been very honest, and I've mentioned that I've still got work to do as well. Let's move into our second one, the relationship conversation, because this is one where things get a little more personal and complicated. Are we investing in the right relationships? That's the question.
This is one of my favorite episodes, actually, for a lot of different reasons. The core idea being that the quality of your relationships is one of the most powerful predictors of how well you age. There's study after study has demonstrated this. It includes cognitively, how we think, how well we think, physically, emotionally, and that not all relationships are created equal.
I remember being so shocked when I first heard this, talking about how you live longer, how you prevent dementia, and all of these things through the quality relationships. Because quite honestly, I just taken relationships for granted, but we shouldn't. But what we're talking about in these relationships isn't the fact that we have friends or people we can talk to, but they're drama-free and they're trust-rich. That's the goal, drama-free and trust-rich.
Those 2 phrases kind of stuck with me. And we also talked about a real biological cost of high drama, low trust relationships, right? We mentioned something called an allostatic load, which is essentially the cumulative wear and tear on the body from chronic stress. We're all familiar with that. The fact that you don't even have to be in the presence of a stressful relationship for it to cost you, frankly. So when you have a really negative relationship, it's not just when you're dealing with that person, just anticipating it, dreading the next interaction. All of that can activate a stress response that's not good for us.
So the question is, are we actually being deliberate about this? Are we making conscious choices about where we invest our relational energy?
I think I'm better at this than I used to be, but I won't pretend that I've got it all figured out.
Okay, so I'm going to punch you a little bit here. What does better mean when you say I'm getting better at this?
So I think I'm generally better or maybe even good. It's in some respects with this one, but it took a life-altering event to get me there. Many of you know that my wife's name is Christy because I talk about her a lot, but I was married to Marsha for 39 years before she was diagnosed with ovarian cancer at 58. and passed away just as she turned 60. During that 2-year time, many of the people who I considered friends seemed to disappear. After Marsha passed, I decided to invest in those people who remained constant friends throughout her illness and no longer actively pursue those who didn't. In the process, I learned to recognize the people who were most valuable in my life without the need for a crisis to suss them out, so to speak. And I'm still making new friends, but I'm quicker to recognize if the commitment to friendship is mutual.
That takes real clarity. And I think one of the things that makes it so hard is that some of the relationships we're talking about really aren't bad relationships exactly. They're just draining. And it's really uncomfortable to acknowledge that. But sometimes we just have to say that some of the people we know and maybe the relationships over the years, the person isn't what they used to be because of their life journey and so forth. But it's turned out that they're just draining us.
Yeah, and they don't even have to be draining, so to speak. They can just be non-supportive in many ways,
Right.
right? And nobody's really talking about cutting people out of your life carelessly. But what we are talking about is being honest with ourselves about where we're investing our energy and whether that investment is actually returning anything to us.
I found as I get older that ageism is real. So I'm still in the workplace for a few more years anyway. And I recognize that some people just don't have anything to say to me or they don't include me in on things.
How does that make you feel?
Actually, it's brought great clarity into my life. At first, I felt a little sad because I thought, oh, I thought I meant more to that person.
Yeah.
And then I realized, nope, not really. I just didn't. And, uh, and that's just the way relationships are. I heard a person one time say that relationships have a shelf life or a life cycle. And I believe that's really true.
Mhm. Yeah, I get that.
And so I'm not their friend in person anymore, but I'm still, still ruminating about them.
Yeah, but we have these negative relationships. We really we're kind of talking about here is negative relationships or relationships don't serve us well. But there really is the other side of that coin, which is the relationships that actually nourish us, right? I just want to remind our listeners the positive benefits we get from the relationships that are meaningful to us, that are filled with trust and so on. They activate what we refer to as the parasympathetic nervous system. They lower cortisol, and those are medicinal reactions to positive relationships. And that can't be bad.
I think what we're trying to say here is that if you're a nourishing presence to somebody and they're a nourishing presence to you, that's good. That's what we want for in our relationships. If they're trustworthy, if they're trust rich, and they're drama free, that's a good relationship. And we might even talk about reciprocity.
Yeah, I love that. This is something that I've been trying to pay attention to more in my life. Am I the kind of friend, am I being on my side of the relationship, the kind of friend that's medicinal? Or am I sometimes a source of drama, right?
I think you are a medicinal friend, Don, at least to me.
But I think it's important that we be aware of our side of the relationship as well. I mean, I have had relationships where I feel like I'm carrying all the water, right? But to be fair, I need to pay attention to my responsibility in that relationship as well.
I think if people can show interest in the other person and then that person is willing to show interest back into them, that's a good start right there. You can sort of measure and gauge a relationship by the willingness of one person to listen to, nourish, and then hand it back to the other person in the same way. Let's talk about another thing called consistency over intensity. It's a health conversation. So why don't we go there?
What do you got to say on that?
Well, it has to do with health is the area where the gap between what I know and what I actually do is most visible.
Let's talk about the health stuff because this one is where I feel like I have the most specific, measurable, and sometimes embarrassing data on myself.
Okay, well, this is a confessions program, so tell us how.
Health is the area where the gap between what I know, because I know a lot about health, I've taken time to study it, and what I actually do, and where that gap is most visible and quantifiable. Okay, so I know what consistency first health looks like, right? I know why the intensity driven reactive model doesn't work for the aging body. I've read the research, I've talked to the researchers, and I have still, on more than one occasion, launched myself into some ridiculous burst of intense activity after a period of neglect, paid for it physically, and then quietly retreated until the next trigger. Let me just mention that I have talked on the podcast before about about 16 months ago. I had rotator cuff surgery on my right shoulder. And the reason why I had to have that is because I decided that I needed to start using weights and was trying to do flies with too much weight. And
Sure.
it really messed up my shoulder.
Well, first of all, I think you describe almost every man I know that's over 50 years of age. But I will also say that sometimes we get to thinking and comparing ourselves to the olden days. So we had a big snow here several months ago, and I just got out that snow shovel and I started going after it. And then I realized about midway through it that I might not should be doing it quite the way I'm doing it. I mean, was there a time when I could, clear that driveway and sidewalk and other pathways? Absolutely. But I'm beginning to notice that that might not be the smart move at a certain age in life.
Here's what I find genuinely interesting, David, when I look back at my own patterns. Okay. The moments when I've actually been consistent, or the times when I've been consistent, when I've had the garden tending relationship with my health rather than the crisis and conquer relationship. Those periods have also been the periods when I felt the best, not just physically, but also mentally and emotionally. There's a baseline steadiness that comes from showing up for yourself daily, even modestly.
This is what the research is really pointing to, the idea of steadiness. It's not dramatic interventions. It's just the daily, steadily do these things every day, over time, consistently. Believe it or not, that's what moves the needle on the health span for you.
I keep coming back to Dr. Miller's work at the Oklahoma Medical Research Foundation last summer and his work on cell mitochondria. And the idea that even moderate, consistent exercise is literally signaling our cells to repair and renew. It's not the heroic gym sessions, it's the showing up with consistency.
Are you showing up consistently?
So if I'm doing well on the relationship front right now, I'm doing poorly on the health consistency piece of the equation. I've been quite active working around the house in the yard, and Christy and I rode our bikes about 18 miles over the last couple of days. So I am doing something, but I've become a real slacker when it comes to a consistent walking habit, and I don't feel good about that. What I would like to get back to is walking 2 miles every day with Sundays off.
And 2 miles, if you're used to walking 10 miles, seems like so little. There were times when I would do 5-mile walks without thinking about it. Now I need to build up to that because one is age. And the second one is like you, winter came and when it was down in the 30s, I said, I'm not getting out there doing that walking. And then when the cold winds came up, it's like, I don't want to walk in that cold wind. So we're just now into springtime and the weather patterns are a bit erratic, but I'm going back to walking is what I'm saying. Because of what we've learned on this program, we don't have to get back to like you were doing at the end of last summer. We just pick it up. And so Carrie and I walk about 2.5 miles almost every day. And I've found that that's helping. And at the same time, Don, I'm doing my yoga twice a week. And cumulatively speaking, I'm feeling a lot better.
Yeah, it's the garden metaphor again. The garden wants daily attention and patience. That's really what we need to be thinking.
Okay, let's go to another thing called the rule breaking conversation. And this one's fun. Let's be honest about how we're actually doing on refusing to fade quietly into the background.
Well, okay, so we talked about this and the cultural scripts that tell us to dress our age, stop learning new things, don't make too much noise, let the young people have the adventures. And the argument we made is that actively, defiantly refusing those scripts isn't just good for your soul, it's biological self defense.
Yeah, biological self defense. And that's a phrase I like right there. It's really good.
I stand by it. And I think this is the area where I feel the most genuinely alive when I'm doing it right.
Can you give me an example of a rule you've broken recently?
Well, this is silly, but I bought two new bright colored summer shirts the other day, and I love them. They're definitely not old man stuff, or maybe they are, but they're not dull old man stuff. You just have to, do what you want to do, and what other people think isn't really matter.
Sure, don't let anybody talk you out of being you, and don't let people shame you for the age, or don't feel like that you have to shrink back. It's really important that you continue to live fully and actively and speak up if there's something you want to say.
And that's the thing about rule breaking at this stage of life. It's usually something smaller, a conversation you have, a class you sign up for, a thing you wear, a thing you say yes to, that the old script said that you should decline.
And also, it's continue to learn things. That keeps your mind nimble, and it helps you stave off the effects of dementia and vascular dementia and things like that. I think I remember you saying that when we started this podcast, you were 65, and you mentioned that you didn't know which end of a microphone to use.
Completely true, and not even slightly exaggerated.
But, but here you are, Don, and everybody can hear for themselves. You're doing just great.
I've started to think about discomfort in learning as actually a positive signal. Like, if this feels embarrassing or hard, that's exactly why I should keep doing it.
There's this notion called the young fool, and the fool is the young fool because they don't know what's ahead for them, right? They don't have the experience in life. But sometimes when we age, we don't like to be the young fool once again and try something new that we've never tried before. That feels a bit uncomfortable for us. But I'm all about breaking that rule. And I think it's time, even as long as you're on the planet, as long as your mind will let you, be the young fool. Try to learn something new, do something different.
So, okay, David, you haven't confessed yet. What rules are you still working on breaking?
Well, I took 2 courses this year. I took 2 courses, and they nearly ate my lunch, but doggone it, if I can do it at this age, I'm just saying that that's stretching yourself right there, and I'm glad I did.
What I think I love about what you just said, okay, so it's honest. I've mentioned before, probably more than our listeners want to hear, that there's a sign above your head in your office that says, I'm still learning. And that is such an honest statement. And you and I aren't standing here today claiming that we've cracked the code that we talk about on our program. We're saying, here's what
No.
we've learned, here's where we're growing, and here's where the work is still very much in progress.
I spend a lot of time these days, Don, thinking about what I call existential things, what makes life worth living, what makes a flourishing life, what makes a happy life. I think people at our stage of life have so much to contribute, but it only works if you'll take the time to process the living that you've done. You don't actually have to have a life that's been an exemplary life. You can learn as much from your mistakes as you did from the things that worked out well. In fact, if you've had a heck of a life, if you're willing to think and reflect over that, there's so much that you can learn and share with others that would make somebody else's life so worthy in living. So I spend a lot of time in those areas too. But if you like working with your hands, or trying a new hobby, or fixing a car, or baking a cake, or tending a garden, all of those things are just as worthy. And get to it, because your brain will love you for it, and you'll find it fulfilling, and it gives you more happiness and purpose in your life.
So, David, these 4 topics that we have discussed and confessed on have been very helpful to me. But I'd like us to zoom out for just a minute here, because I think there's a meta lesson in all of this, something that we've both learned, not just from the research or not just from the work we do on the podcasts, but from actually trying to live it.
Well, let's talk about some of those, and let's let you start with this.
Knowing the thing and living the thing are 2 completely different skills, and the gap between them is not a sign of failure. The gap is where the actual work happens. So, if our listeners and you and I, when we think about and talk about these topics and we learn more about them, that is a start, okay? That is a beginning point. But it's what we do with that that really makes a difference.
That's right. You can learn. I mean, today, ChatGPT can teach you so many things. But here's the thing, Don, ChatGPT can't live your life. So knowing this stuff and having great insights about it isn't the same thing as applying it to your life and being transformed because of the things you're learning.
When I first started reading and thinking seriously about all this stuff, the psychology of aging, the identity shifts, the relational science, there was a part of me that thought, okay, now I understand it, so now I'll do it differently. And if inside itself was the transformation, then great, but it's not.
And the thing of it is that you don't have to do all of it at once. Just find something, just a single thing. Just remember that your neurons, when you start something new, will begin to fire differently. And as they reorient themselves, it's going to change you. But applying new things, that's where it's really at.
You used the word reorient, which I really love. When I was younger, I used to do something called orienteering. The living is actually the territory. The
Yes.
insight, what we hear, what we learn is just the map, and we've got to then live it, right? And the territory is messier, more resistant, more surprising. It's always more surprising than the map actually suggests.
Sure, we can say don't over-explain yourself. But if you really do it, and if you really stop over-explaining yourself, that's when the real change happens, right?
Yeah, after 50 plus years of firing in a certain patterns, our brains are not going to reorient themselves just because we listen to a podcast.
Well,
Yeah, yeah,
I
a
know,
very
right?
good podcast, right?
Yeah, because you're very persuasive, Don.
So, by the way, this is both humbling and encouraging. Humbling because the work is real and ongoing, and encouraging because it means we're not behind. We're just in process, David.
To me, there's a meta lesson in here on how interconnected all of these things are. We've mentioned, just several of our podcasts, 4 of these in particular. But if you really stop and think about them, just working on one of them is kind of like working on all of them.
All these parts are a part of one large system, which is our life.
That's right, all one system. And if you pull on one thread, it tends to move things in the other areas of life too, which is encouraging.
I definitely prefer encouraging. But what I keep coming back to, and I think this is maybe the simplest, most honest thing I can say, is that I'm glad we're having these conversations out loud, because there's something about saying it publicly, about committing to it in front of an audience, that creates a different kind of accountability than just thinking about it privately.
I think that's a beautiful argument for community, even a listening community or a podcast community like ours, because it's part of the relational investment that we've talked about. We're not just talking about you in a real sense. We're doing this with you, and we hope you understand that.
That's exactly right. And if you're listening to this and thinking, yeah, I know the lesson and I'm still not quite living it, you're in good company. You're in our company.
So we turned the lens on ourselves today, and we've tried to be honest in telling you what we've been doing. And I don't know, Don, in the old days, we would give ourselves a grade, but because we are seniors and because we've lived life and gone through all these experiences and we've seen ourselves and we know who we are, I give every one of us, including you and me, everyone in the audience, an A++.
If you listened to this show, you know is exactly where we want to be.
Still learning, always still learning.
Always.
Thanks for being with us here today on the 5th Season podcast. If this conversation landed for you in some way, if you heard yourself somewhere in the admissions that Donna and I made, we'd love to hear from you. Share where you're at with these lessons. Let us know what's sticking, what's hard, and what's still a work in progress.
Because aging well isn't a solo project, it's a conversation, and we're grateful you're part of ours.
Now, next week, we're going to be exploring the importance of sleep as we age. So until next time, take care of yourself and choose the garden over the crisis.
Do it well.